Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a really complex mission. We're peeling back the layers of a state that, on the surface, seems like America's polite, stable heartland.
Right.
Yet it's also a place that is constantly pushing the envelope. We're talking technology, political experiments, and some really intense cultural shifts.
It's a land of deep contradictions.
Exactly. We are diving deep into Minnesota, the Star of the North, the land of the, many, many lakes.
It truly is a study in contrasts. And to really get a handle on the state, you have to look at its scale versus its population. It's huge.
It's the 12th largest state by area.
Yeah.
So you imagine these vast forests and prairies.
But then you see it's only the 22nd most populous state with about, 5.8 million residents? That tells you there's a massive amount of wild, open space.
And when we talk about that open space, you just have to talk about the water. I mean, everyone knows the nickname, the land of 10,000 lakes.
But that's not even close, is it?
No, not at all. Our sources give the true and honestly astonishing count. Minnesota officially has 14,420 bodies of fresh water that are at least 10 acres each.
Wow. That density of water just defines everything, the ecology, the culture, everything.
It really does. And that identity is even baked into its official profile. The state motto is totally unique.
It's the only one in French, right? L'Étoile du Nord.
Star of the North. And it makes perfect sense geographically. It's the northernmost state in the contiguous U.S., touching Lake Superior in Canada.
But with all that land and all that water, what's really fascinating is how centralized the population is. I mean, if you want to understand Minnesota, you have to understand the Twin Cities.
Absolutely. The urban core is basically the whole story for most of the people there.
Right. Something like 60% of all Minnesotans, that's 3.71 million people, live in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area.
Which makes the Twin Cities the 16th largest metro area in the entire country. All the state's economic, political, and cultural gravity is just concentrated right there.
Leaving the rest of this enormous state vast and, pretty sparsely populated.
Okay, so let's unpack this and start right at the foundation. The name itself. It comes from the Dakota language. And the meaning, it captures that water identity perfectly. But there's a little bit of ambiguity there, too.
It's a wonderful piece of linguistic geography. The name Minnesota comes from the Dakota, from one of two very closely related phrases.
Okay.
It's often cited as mi-sota, which means clear blue water. But it can also be interpreted as Minnesota, which means cloudy water.
So clear or cloudy, that duality sort of speaks to what the lakes actually look like, right? Sometimes they reflect that perfect blue sky. Other times they're a bit churned up.
Exactly. And I love the story of how the Dakota people actually demonstrated this for early settlers. They didn't just point and translate.
They gave a visual aid.
They did. Reportedly, they would drop a few drops of milk into a cup of water and then call the resulting milky, cloudy liquid mi-sota.
So not crystal clear, but what's the translation? Sky-tinted water.
Sky-tinted water. It's beautiful. It means water that's been given a color, a presence.
And once you know that root, ni for water, you start seeing it everywhere in the region. It connects the state's whole identity back to that original language.
It's undeniable. The root ni is central to so much of the local geography. You have Minnehaha,
curling water, a waterfall.
Minnetonka, which is big water, and of course the big one, Minneapolis.
Which is a hybrid name.
Yeah, a hybrid. It takes the Dakota ni and just sticks on the Greek suffix Apolis for city, so it's literally the city of water.
So the state is named for water, the biggest city is named for water, and even the state seal has the phrase Minnesota Makoche on it.
The land where the water reflects the skies. It's a remarkably cohesive identity, linking the modern state right back to its indigenous environmental past.
And that connection is so important, especially when we talk about the next stage, the arrival of Europeans.
Right. The earliest Europeans were French voyageurs and fur traders. This was back in the 17th century. And they were, expert navigators of all those lakes and rivers. They encountered two major indigenous groups.
The Dakota and the Ojibwe.
Exactly. You had the long-established Dakota, especially eastern Dakota, and then the migrating Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe.
And their relationship defined the territory for a long time.
For centuries. The two nations had their own territories and often contested resources along the waterways. The Ojibwe were gradually migrating west and south, pushing into traditional Dakota lands, which led to localized conflict long before settlers showed up and complicated things even more.
And when the United States finally acquired the land, it wasn't just one clean transaction. It was split by the Mississippi River.
It was a total patchwork. The territory east of the Mississippi was gained after the American Revolutionary War, but the huge area west of the Mississippi, that only became U.S. property with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
And even then, the northern border wasn't set.
No, it was contested by the British Hudson's Bay Company. It was finally settled at the 49th parallel with the Treaty of 1818.
So once that huge territory was claimed, the next move was to control the major waterways. And that led to really the single most important military post in the region.
Fort Snelling, no question. It was established between 1819 and 1825, right at that stunning confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers.
A critical spot.
The most critical spot. It was for controlling fur trade routes, monitoring indigenous movements, and just asserting U.S. sovereignty.
But the fort became more than just a military outpost, right? It was really the seed for the whole economic engine of the Twin Cities.
Precisely. The soldiers there had to be self-sufficient, so they built a gristmill and, more importantly, a sawmill right at the nearby St. Anthony Falls. That waterfall became the power source for industry.
And that's what created Minneapolis.
Yeah.
What about St. Paul?
St. Paul developed a little downriver. The military established a reservation in 1839, and they forced squatters off the fort lands. Those squatters moved and formed the settlement that eventually became the state capital.
So the U.S. had the land, they had the strategic center at Fort Snelling, and statehood followed pretty quickly in 1858. But that period, just before and after statehood, it was poisoned by the pressure on the native population.
And that leads directly to a devastating conflict. This is where we have to confront the dark foundation of Minnesota's story, the Dakota War of 1862.
What was the situation for the Dakota at that point?
By the 1850s, the eastern Dakota were confined to reservations, mostly because of these fraudulent and coercive treaties, the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota in 1851.
And in exchange for 28 million acres of their land, they were promised millions in annuities and supplies.
Promises that were chronically broken.
Or payments just didn't come.
Right. Agents and traders often withheld them, and by 1862, the Dakota were facing actual starvation. There's a famous quote from a trader who told the starving Dakota, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass."
Just brutal. So the tension was like an open wound, and all it needed was a spark.
And that spark came in August of 1862. On August 17th, 4 young Dakota men, desperate for food, killed a family of white settlers near a town called Acton.
And that one incident just set everything off.
Immediately. It prompted a faction of the Dakota, led by Chief Little Crow, to try and stage a full-scale expulsion of settlers from the Minnesota River Valley. They saw it as their last possible chance to reclaim their land and feed their people.
The conflict was short, only about 6 weeks, but the toll on civilians was horrific. Hundreds of settlers were killed, thousands fled, and when the U.S. military finally subdued the fighting, the state's response was just brutal vengeance.
It was a horrific period. Roughly 400 Dakota men were tried by these military commissions. The proceedings were rushed with very little legal representation.
And the sentences were extreme.
Of those tried, 303 were sentenced to death by hanging. The scale of that proposed execution was completely unprecedented.
And this is where President Lincoln gets involved. It's a complicated part of the story.
It is. Lincoln personally reviewed every single one of the trial transcripts. He was trying to distinguish between those who had participated in massacres of civilians and those who had only fought in battles against soldiers.
And he reduced the number.
He did. He approved only 39 death sentences, which was then reduced to 38 after a last-minute reprieve.
But even with that reduction, what happened in Mankato in December 1862 is still a chilling historical marker.
The execution of those 38 Dakota men remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history. It was an act of public justice, really, aimed at satisfying the outrage of the settlers, and it solidified the state's determination to just completely eliminate the indigenous presence.
And the rhetoric from the political leaders at the time was, well, genocidal.
It absolutely was. The governor, Alexander Ramsey, declared that the Sioux must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. And that wasn't just talk. It became official policy.
They put a bounty on scalps.
Ramsey established a bounty of $25 on Dakota men's scalps. His successor, Governor Henry Swift, later raised it to $200.
It's hard to even comprehend that.
It is. And while the records show that surprisingly few bounties were actually paid out, Only 4, totaling $325, including for the killing of Little Crow. The system itself formalized a state policy of extermination.
But what happened to the non-combatants, the women, the children, the elderly? That's where the human cost is just staggering.
Over 1,600 Dakota non-combatants were forcibly marched to an internment camp on Pike Island, right below Fort Snelling. The conditions were just abysmal.
Through a Minnesota winter.
Through a brutal Minnesota winter. And despite some efforts by one commander to build a protective wall, disease and exposure just took a terrible toll. Estimates suggest anywhere from 125 to 300 died before the survivors were officially exiled from the state to the barren Crow Creek Reservation in what is now South Dakota.
That context it's just vital. You can't talk about the land where the water reflects the skies without acknowledging the tragedy of the people who originally named it.
That history is written on the land itself, which I think is a good transition. Let's shift our focus from the historical conflicts on the land to the foundational structure beneath it.
Exactly. Let's move into part 2 and talk about Minnesota's incredible physical state. We can start with the timeline written in its rocks. And what's astonishing here is the age. We are talking about rocks that are nearly as old as the Earth.
We really are. Minnesota has some of the planet's oldest rocks, specifically gneisses that have been dated to roughly 3.6 billion years old.
Just to put that in perspective for you, the listener, that's about 80% as old as the planet itself. These are among the most ancient materials ever found on Earth's surface.
Yeah, let me just synthesize that for you. We are talking about foundational crust, 3.6 billion years old, right next to land that was carved out just 12,000 years ago by glaciers. That is an insane contrast of geological timescales in one state.
It is. And those ancient rocks are directly tied to the major economic feature of the North, the Iron Range.
Right, the Iron Range is part of that massive Canadian shield structure. The iron deposits themselves formed about 2.7 billion years ago, as these immense basaltic lava flows poured out, creating a primordial ocean floor where iron accumulated.
So we have the birth of the continent, and then much, much later, the Ice Age comes and just completely redefines the landscape. It's scraped it down and deposits all that famous glacial drift.
The glaciers were the sculptors of modern Minnesota. The last big event, the Wisconsin glaciation, retreated about 12,000 years ago. It covered and reshaped almost the entire state. Almost the entire state. There's one critical area that it missed, which we call the driftless zone.
What exactly is the driftless zone? Why did the ice skip it?
Well, the driftless zone is this area in the southeastern corner of the state. It also extends into Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois that was never covered by that last ice sheet. The main lobe of the ice just sort of divided and flowed around the region, probably due to some subtle underlying geology.
And what does that mean for the landscape there? How is it different?
It's totally different. Instead of the gentle rolling hills covered in glacial till that you see everywhere else, the driftless zone has these steep, unglaciated bluffs, deep river valleys, and streams that cut sharply right into the bedrock. It's rugged, dramatic, a complete contrast.
You know, for a state that seems so flat and defined by lakes, I was surprised to see it has real elevation extremes.
It does. While most of the state is a gently rolling peneplain, the highest point is Eagle Mountain, which gets up to 2,301 feet. The low point is the shore of Lake Superior at 601 feet.
And they're right next to each other.
They're only 13 miles apart. It just shows that dramatic drop-off right near the massive deep basin of Lake Superior.
Okay, let's get back to the water, because beyond just the sheer number of lakes, Minnesota has this truly profound hydrological phenomenon, the triple watershed.
The triple watershed is a genuine geographical rarity. It's a statement of continental centrality. There is a precise point near the town of Hibbing where a drop of rain can ultimately flow into 3 different major ocean basins.
Okay, walk us through those 3 routes.
Certainly. So water can flow south through the Mississippi River system and eventually empty into the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
It can flow east through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Or, and this is the critical third one, it can flow north into the Red River of the North, which leads to the Hudson Bay watershed, and from there to the Arctic Ocean.
It literally sits at the hydrological nexus of North America.
It absolutely does.
And of course, Lake Itasca is where one of the world's great rivers begins its journey.
Yes. The mighty Mississippi starts its 680-mile trip across the state right there. And beyond the rivers and lakes, we have to talk about the wetlands. Minnesota has something like 10.6 million acres of wetlands.
Which is the most of any state besides Alaska.
Exactly. It means the state is basically this massive natural water filter, which is crucial for maintaining that clear blue water identity we talked about.
And how do all these features translate into the ecosystems?
Well, Minnesota is this critical transition zone. It spans 4 distinct ecological provinces. You move from prairie parkland in the west, through the Big Woods, which is an eastern broadleaf forest, and then up into the Laurentian mixed forest in the north, which is a mix of coniferous, boreal, and deciduous hardwoods.
Now, given that logging was such a huge early industry, and we'll get to that, I imagine a lot of that original forest was destroyed.
Yeah. Oh, a ton of the old-growth forest was cleared in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But regrowth and really diligent conservation have been very successful. About a third of the state is forested today. And crucially, there are pockets of true old-growth forest preserved in the massive federal lands up north.
You're talking about the Superior National Forest and the Boundary Waters.
Exactly. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness alone is 1 million acres with over 1,000 lakes. It's got about 400,000 acres of unlogged land. It's one of the largest protected wilderness areas in the lower 48.
And what kind of wildlife thrives there?
Minnesota is notable for having the largest population of timber wolves outside of Alaska. It also has the largest number of breeding pairs of bald eagles in the lower 48, at least as of 2007. And it supports huge populations of moose, black bears, and a ton of migratory birds.
Okay, finally, let's address the elephant in the room, or maybe the snowbank in the room, the climate. People define Minnesota by its cold.
And for good reason. It's an extreme continental climate. We are talking about a massive range. The lowest official temperature ever recorded was a shocking minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit in Tower back in 1996.
Minus 60. And the high.
The highest was 114 degrees in Moorhead in 1936. That is a 174-degree temperature swing. It just speaks to the complete lack of any moderating ocean influence.
And that has a huge impact on agriculture, right?
Yeah.
The growing season must be really short.
It's incredibly short. It ranges from only about 90 frost-free days in the far northeast near Lake Superior to a more comfortable 160 days down in the southeast. That dictates everything about what you can grow and when.
And now, climate change is starting to impact the state's most fundamental identity, the water itself.
Yeah, the impact is subtle, but it's significant. Rising lake temperatures are forcing shifts in the ecosystems. Cold water species like lake trout, they're losing their habitat, being pushed further north.
And warm water fish are taking over.
Exactly. Species like bass and sunfish are thriving and expanding their range. It's a huge deal for the future of the state's iconic fishing culture.
That connection between geology, water, and climate really sets the stage for the economic engine. So moving into part 3, let's trace Minnesota's economic evolution. It's a classic American story. You start with raw materials, and then you pivot aggressively into high-tech and services.
The earliest economy was all about resource extraction. Logging was first and foremost, made possible by all those rivers for transport. Sawmills popped up at key points like St. Anthony Falls, Pine City, Stillwater, and Winona, just processing the vast northern forests.
And St. Anthony Falls gave Minneapolis its first identity, flower power.
Absolutely. The falls provided incredible hydropower for milling, and it turned Minneapolis into the world's leading flour producer by the late 19th century. But the key wasn't just volume, it was innovation.
Right, they developed Minnesota patent flour. What made it so special?
It was a quality revolution. Traditional milling often left fine particles of the wheat kernel's middlings in the flour, which made it kind of dark and lower grade. Minneapolis millers adopted new roller mills and purifying tech to strip all that away.
So you get a whiter, finer, higher protein product.
Exactly. And this Minnesota patent flour was so superior that it commanded almost double the price of the old baker's flour. It made Minnesota the epicenter of the global grain trade.
And this is where we get the giants we know today.
Pillsbury, Northwestern, and the Washburn-Crosby Company, which eventually became General Mills. Their dominance was built on this one innovation. By 1900, Minnesota mills were grinding 14.1% of all the grain in the United States.
That's incredible dominance. So then we shift north to the Iron Range, back to those ancient 2.7 billion-year-old rocks. The discovery of high-grade ore really defined the early 20th century for this state.
Yeah, the discovery of iron ore in the Vermilion and Mesabi ranges in the 1880s kicked off an absolute boom. This high-grade, easily accessible ore was shipped by rail to Duluth loaded onto massive ships and sent through the Great Lakes to steel mills in the east. It was the backbone of American industrialization.
But that high-grade ore is finite. What happened when it started to run out after World War II? That should have been an economic disaster.
It should have been. But this is where Minnesota's innovative spirit, the same spirit that created patent flour, kicked in again. The problem was that the remaining iron was a low-grade ore called taconite.
So what exactly is taconite? It's harder to process.
It's very hard, low-grade iron ore embedded in rock. You can't just ship it and smelt it. It looked like the end of the Iron Range. But a guy named Dr. E.W. Davis at the University of Minnesota, he pioneered a process in the 1940s.
What was that process?
You crush the taconite rock into a fine powder, use magnets to separate the iron particles, and then you bind that powder into these hard, marble-sized pellets.
So the technology of pelletization literally saved the Iron Range.
It saved the entire industry. It allowed them to use this previously worthless material. Today, even though the high-grade ore is mostly gone, taconite mining continues. As of 2016, Minnesota still accounted for about 60% of the country's usable iron ore.
It's a testament to innovation. And that sets the stage for the real pivot, the post-war boom that shifted the state from raw materials into high technology.
The shift was systematic and rapid. Minnesota became a tech hub almost overnight, focusing first on computing. The whole lineage starts with a company called Engineering Research Associates, or ERA. It was formed right after the war in 1946 to build specialized computers for the Navy.
And that DNA eventually evolved into the supercomputer industry.
Exactly. ERA merged into Sperry Rand. Then, a key figure, William Norris, left Sperry in 1957 to form Control Data Corporation, or CDC, which became a global leader. And then most famously, Seymour Cray left CDC to form Cray Research, dedicating himself to building the world's fastest supercomputers.
So for decades, if you wanted the bleeding edge in computing power, you looked to Minnesota.
He did. And at the same time, the state was pioneering medical technology. Medtronic. It was founded in the Twin Cities in 1949, initially focusing on battery-powered pacemakers. This really established the state as a major center for biomedical tech.
And anchoring all of this is probably the most famous nonprofit medical institution in the world.
The Mayo Clinic, founded in Rochester back in 1864. What's often overlooked is that the Mayo Clinic grew in a pretty rural setting. It was built on this partnership between the Mayo family and the Franciscan sisters, and it leveraged this early focus on teamwork and research to become a global leader.
And today, it's Minnesota's largest private employer.
By far. And it's consistently ranked #1 on major hospital honor rolls.
Looking at the modern economy, the corporate clout of Minnesota is just phenomenal for a state that people sometimes dismiss as flyover country.
The diversity of these corporate headquarters gives it incredible resilience. The state's GDP was $383 billion in 2019, and it ranks 13th in the nation for per capita personal income. You've got 33 of the top 1,000 publicly traded companies headquartered there.
So who are the big names defining that modern clout?
Well, you're talking about massive retailers like Target, industrial giants like 3M, health service powerhouses like United Health Group, and of course the legacy food companies like General Mills, plus Best Buy and electronics.
And the single largest privately owned company in the whole U.S. is based there, reinforcing that dominance in agribusiness.
That would be Cargill. So when you look at that list, food, health, retail, science, high-tech, it's a fundamentally diversified, high-value economy. It's not just about digging things out of the ground anymore.
Right. And before we move on to culture, let's just quickly touch on modern agriculture and energy, because Minnesota still leads in some very specific niches.
They're huge agricultural players, but often in specialized processing. Minnesota is the largest national producer of sugar beets, sweet corn, and peas for processing. And a fun fact, they're the #1 producer of farm-raised turkeys.
And there's a strong cultural emphasis on collaboration in food.
Yes. Minnesota has the most food cooperatives per capita in the entire U.S., which really reflects that deep-rooted populist and communal culture from its Scandinavian and German farming heritage.
And finally, they were pioneers in biofuel.
They were the first state to mandate a 10% ethanol mix, or E10. Beyond that, they've become a major clean energy player, ranking in the top 10 for wind energy production. Wind generates nearly 1/5 of the state's total electricity.
It's a compelling blend of tradition and forward-looking policy.
It really is.
Okay, moving seamlessly into part 4, let's talk about the people, the culture, and the intensely interesting political profile of Minnesota. And let's start with demographics, because the stereotype of a state that is just monolithically Scandinavian is rapidly dissolving.
The historical narrative is certainly dominated by those massive waves of German and Scandinavian immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And today, the top ancestries are still German at 33.8% and Norwegian at 15.3%. That heritage forms the core identity.
But the state has gone through a dramatic demographic transformation over the last few decades.
A profound one. The white population has dropped from over 98% in the mid-20th century to 77.5% by 2020. And this transformation is really unique compared to its Midwestern neighbors, largely because Minnesota became a kind of refugee central.
That's a critical detail that often gets missed.
It is. As of 2018, Minnesota had the largest refugee population per capita of any state. It hosted 13% of the country's refugees, despite having only 2% of the country's population. This was due to deliberate resettlement policies and strong social services that made it a supportive environment.
So who are the major communities defining this new global Minnesota?
Well, Minnesota is now home to the nation's largest Somali American population, who were primarily resettled in the Twin Cities after fleeing civil war. It also has the second largest Hmong community in the country, who started arriving after the Vietnam War.
And there are other significant groups too.
Oh yeah, Ethiopians, Vietnamese, Liberians, and recently Ukrainians. This influx has created a truly multicultural core that is both challenging and enriching that older, homogenous culture.
And this blend of cultures is reflected in its surprisingly vibrant arts scene. For a Midwestern state, the Twin Cities have this outsized, almost East Coast reputation for performing arts.
It punches way above its weight. Minneapolis ranks second only to New York City in the sheer number of theater companies. And as a measure of engagement, the Twin Cities sold 2.3 million theater tickets annually back in 2006.
And they have the country's largest non-juried performing arts festival.
Minnesota Fringe Festival, yeah. It's huge.
The literary tradition is equally strong, and what's great is how Minnesota is portrayed in literature in these wildly conflicting ways.
You see this fascinating dual nature. On one hand, you have the heroic, often tragic pioneer hardships in books like Ole Rolvog's Giants in the Earth, or the tales of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
And on the other hand, you have the famous small-town critiques.
Like Sinclair Lewis, he was a native, and he painted this grim picture of stifling conformity in his novels like Main Street. He contrasts so sharply with the later, much gentler, almost nostalgic portrayal of Lake Wobegon by Garrison Keillor.
So it's this cultural debate over small-town life. Is it stifling or is it sweetly communal?
Exactly. And we can't forget the titans of American music and literature from the state.
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
A St. Paul native, he drew heavily on the social circles of the young city. And of course, Bob Dylan, born in Duluth, who won the 2016 Nobel Prize in Literature. Then you have Prince, who changed music forever, and the Andrews Sisters of Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy fame.
And in terms of unique media, you have Peanuts, created by St. Paul's own Charles M. Schulz, and the cult classic Mystery Science Theater 3000. Which brings us to the most defining and often parodied cultural trait. Minnesota nice.
Ah, Minnesota nice. It's a famous but complicated stereotype. It refers to this tendency towards courtesy, conflict avoidance, and a general lack of overt emotional display.
So it's politeness taken to an extreme, sometimes at the expense of honesty.
That's often the critique. It can manifest as indirect communication or even passive aggression. It's often paired with that distinctive North Central American English accent, with its Scandinavian intonations sprinkled with phrases like "oof duh" or "you betcha."
And if you want to understand the community heart of the state, you have to look at the food, and specifically the state fair.
The local food culture is all about comfort and community. You have hot dishes, these creamy casseroles, and lutefisk dinners. But the Minnesota State Fair, the Great Minnesota Get-Together, is an institution unto itself.
How big of an institution are we talking about?
It's enormous. In 2014, in a state of 5.5 million people, it drew over 1.8 million visitors in 12 days. It's legendary for its quirky traditions. Intricate seed art, huge butter sculptures of the dairy princesses, and most famously, its relentless dedication to serving dozens of varieties of food on a stick.
That focus on community and consensus seems so at odds with Minnesota's progressive, often fiery political reputation. So let's shift to that unique political landscape, which is incredibly high participation.
This is maybe the most critical distinction for Minnesota. They consistently have the highest voter turnout in the nation. In the 2020 election, participation hit an astonishing 79.96%.
And they make it easy with things like Election Day registration.
Right, it removes a key barrier. And what's fascinating is where that active electorate places its presidential loyalty. They have an unmatched streak of supporting the Democratic nominee.
They hold the longest current streak, right, going back to 1976.
It is. And to highlight how deep that loyalty runs, Minnesota is the only state in the nation that did not vote for Ronald Reagan in either of his campaigns, though they did vote for Nixon in '72.
So why is Minnesota such a liberal bastion compared to its culturally similar neighbors?
The root is in history, specifically the history of populist agrarian movements. A lot of European immigrants who were involved in the failed liberal revolutions of 1848 settled here. That fostered a really strong early center of labor and social activism.
Which led directly to the formation of the unique Democratic Farmer-Labor Party.
Exactly. The DFL is an alliance formed in 1944 when the Democratic Party merged with the powerful, historically progressive Farmer-Labor Party. This cemented a coalition between urban labor unions and agrarian populist interests, giving the party this unique breadth of support.
And that DFL party has been incredibly effective recently, achieving a trifecta in 2023.
They did. For the first time in many years, the DFL gained control of all three branches of government: the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. And this led to just a rapid, massive wave of progressive reforms.
And we should detail those reforms. What were some of the landmark changes passed in that 2023 session that show this political shift?
It was an explosion of governance. The DFL-controlled legislature passed several huge laws. For instance, they implemented mandatory paid family and medical leave for almost all workers.
Wow, that's big.
It is. They also codified sweeping environmental legislation, requiring the state's electricity to be 100% carbon-free by 2040. And they dramatically expanded social programs, including instituting universal free school meals for all K-12 students. It was just a tidal wave of progressive policy after decades of divided government.
Which shows that extreme political tension in the state, a highly progressive core versus a more conservative outstate region. How's that reflected in their federal delegation?
It's perfectly balanced in the House. The delegation is split 4 DFL representatives and 4 Republican representatives. But both U.S. Senate seats are currently held by Democrats. It's a purple state defined by polarized regions, but the Twin Cities' power often tips statewide races.
Okay, finally in part 5, let's explore how all these factors, the wealth, the social activism, the strong educational history, culminate in a quality of life that is consistently rated among the best in the nation. Let's start with health.
Minnesota is routinely ranked among the healthiest states. The indicators are really strong. Low rates of premature death, low infant mortality, high life expectancies, and critically, very high rates of physical activity. That ties directly back to that outdoor recreation culture.
But those high overall rankings can often hide disparities, right?
It does, and Minnesota confronts that. While the state performs excellently on average, it faces significant and persistent health disparities within its minority and new immigrant populations. It's a major policy focus, recognizing that those high rankings need to be equitable for everyone, especially with the growth of the Somali and Hmong communities.
And we have to reiterate the sheer weight of the Mayo Clinic in this health profile.
The Mayo Clinic is a foundational powerhouse. U.S. News & World Report ranked it first on its Best Hospitals honor roll for 2020-21. But its impact isn't isolated. It's linked through partnerships with the University of Minnesota, focusing on critical research into things like cancer and Alzheimer's disease.
And moving on to education, the commitment there seems just as strong.
Educational attainment is exceptionally high. Minnesota has the second highest proportion of high school graduates nationally at 91.5%, and the 10th highest proportion of people with bachelor's degrees.
And that translates into civic outcomes. Minneapolis was named the most literate city in 2015.
With St. Paul ranking 4th. And their K-12 students measure up exceptionally well on a global scale. In a 2013 international study of 8th grade math and science, Minnesota students ranked 8th globally and 3rd in the U.S., behind only Massachusetts and Vermont.
And Minnesota was the birthplace of the charter school movement.
They opened the nation's very first charter school in 1991.
That high quality of life feeds right into the outdoor recreation culture, which just defines daily life for so many Minnesotans. The state seems built for year-round activity.
It's a key part of the culture. Minnesotans have high levels of physical activity, which often revolves around water in the summer. The weekend trip to the cabin on a lake is a core cultural ritual. It's no surprise that water skiing was invented in Minnesota.
But the real test is how they embrace the long, harsh winters. They turn the cold into an asset.
They absolutely do. Ice fishing is hugely popular, a tradition from Scandinavian immigration. Hockey is practically a religion, and the state maintains nearly 20,000 miles of snowmobile trails.
And you mentioned a very specific, unique sport they play there.
Yes, bandy. It's a form of field hockey played on ice, often called soccer on ice skates. Minnesota is the only U.S. state where organized bandy is played, maintaining that unique connection to its Scandinavian roots.
That's a fascinating detail. And speaking of sports culture, the state has teams in all the major professional leagues.
They do. The Vikings, the Twins, the Timberwolves, the Wild, the Lynx. But there's that unique distinction about the Twins' World Series wins.
Right. There are two wins in 1987 and 1991. What was the unique fact there?
In both of those World Series, both of them went to 7 games. The home team won every single game.
Wow.
It suggests this incredible home field advantage, probably driven by the deafening environment of the old Metrodome and that fervent fan culture we talked about.
And on the amateur side, you can't talk about winter sports without the Miracle on Ice.
That gold medal-winning 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team, coached by Minnesota native Herb Brooks, was a testament to the state's talent pipeline. Of the 12 players on that team were Minnesota natives. The state just consistently produces world-class winter athletes.
Okay, let's bring our deep dive to a close. We started with Minnesota's deep foundations. 3.6 billion years of geology, its unique triple watershed hydrology, and the tragic, violent history of the Dakota War of 1862 that led to the largest mass execution in U.S. history.
We tracked its economic genius. That ability to pivot from extraction timber, flour, iron into specialized innovation, particularly with the post-war computer revolution led by Cray, and its anchor in global health with the Mayo Clinic. And what stands out is that political resilience, the DFL coalition maintaining that presidential blue streak since '76.
And we noted the cultural markers, the complex reality of Minnesota Nice, the rich literary tradition, the unique state fair, all wrapped up in a high quality of life framework with excellence in health and education. The state is defined by that Dakota phrase, Minnesota Makoche, the land where the water reflects the skies.
But the state is evolving so rapidly. We noted that the white population has dropped dramatically, largely because Minnesota became this major hub for refugee resettlement. It's now home to the nation's largest Somali population and second largest Hmong community.
So what does this all mean for the future, especially given that dramatic political shift in 2023?
Given Minnesota's consistently high quality of life rankings, coupled with its status as a major hub for refugee resettlement, how might this blend of deeply rooted Scandinavian heritage and fast-growing global diversity shape the state's political and social trajectory over the next generation? Will that progressive wave, symbolized by the huge DFL reforms in 2023 like mandatory paid family leave and the clean energy mandate, be embraced by this increasingly diverse populace? Or will the cultural friction in the vast outstate region define the next chapter for the Star of the North? That is the question you are left to ponder.